Hello, my name is Ali, and this is my final presentation for our Black Studies class. I decided to focus on the topic of Jim Crow laws. Throughout this presentation, that is what I'm going to be speaking about and giving facts about. Um, what are Jim Crow laws? So, Jim Crow laws are laws that separated black and white Americans in public places. This could have been like schools, transportation, and restaurants. It could also be like bathrooms, offices, anything that the public can access. The southern states were the first to adopt these type of laws, and they began right after the Reconstruction period. Um, The origins of Jim Crow laws is that state and local legislators enacted these type of laws to legitimize racial segregation. It was created as a way to create a legal system that actually reinforced white supremacy. It actually was very like not important to like everyone, but important to white individuals with all due respect because it gave them spatial boundaries that was based on race. A part of society actually used Jim Crow laws to define and protect territories because it actually allowed states to draw territorial lines through properties that reinforced the discrimination and isolation of black communities. So what this means is like, like certain like properties, obviously only white individuals could own. It was very hard for black individuals to own any form of property. And sometimes, with all due respect, even black individuals themselves were seen as property, especially when it came to like elections. Black Americans were obviously mistreated simply because of their race. Um, One important Supreme Court case is Plessy versus Ferguson. We actually learned about this in our textbook. Just a little background. Homer Plessy, was actually arrested for sitting in a whites-only car of a Louisiana train. This at that time was called as the Separate Car Act. The funny thing is that he was actually mixed. Um, However, he was classified as a black individual. From what I read, is that he was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. However, even if you were mixed, you were classified as a black individual. Segregation did not in itself constitute unlawful discrimination. That was the ruling of the justices in Plessy versus Ferguson. They argued that separate treatment did not actually imply the inferiority of African Americans. Furthermore, some examples of Jim Crow laws. I actually found this website. It's in my reference page. It's a website that for some states it gives like examples of Jim Crow laws. So I just picked like three states, one of them being Kentucky. At that time, an example would have been children who went to like reform schools or any type of schools. They needed to be separated based on their race. So that means they would go to different classrooms. So there would be classrooms where only black children could go to, and there were classrooms that only white children could go to. In Alabama, actually, white nurses could not nurse in either public or private hospitals when there was a black man or men present in that hospital. In Alabama, there was also separate bathrooms for racists, separate restaurants for racists, and separate transportation for racists. And then in Florida, there was the prohibition of intermarriage. So this is, for example, a white individual marrying a black individual that was prohibited. And again, different schools for both white and black individuals. Simply again, white individuals go to one school, black individuals go to another school. Obviously, with discrimination, racism, things like that, it has a serious effects on African Americans. Some of these effects were, for example, with banks. Banks would give more severe terms when a black individual was taking out or got accepted for a loan. They obviously had worse access, to quality education because they weren't able to get the proper education, if any at all. This prohibited them from getting a fair income, because they couldn't really get fair jobs, and because they weren't getting a good income, it prohibited from them or their families from living in a safe neighborhood. They also had unequal access to healthcare. Obviously, healthcare was at that time still expensive in that time. If you're getting paid at a low income and dealing with discrimination and racism, it makes it more harder to get healthcare because Black individuals were not getting a fair access to healthcare. They were getting risk of chronic or infectious diseases, and they were not, unfortunately, getting any treatment. I'm sorry, some of the effects on African Americans is obviously that racism, discrimination, and stereotypes that arise from this. Some of the things they were seeing is that they were unworthy, they were unfit, and they were less deserving of these fundamental rights that individuals should have. Now, there was obviously voting restrictions during the Jim Crow period. Some of these restrictions unfortunately included violence. That mean that when individuals were going to vote or did vote, they were unfortunately harmed, beaten, or even killed. If they weren't harmed or beaten or killed, unfortunately, their families could suffer that as well. There was also a literacy test. At that time, individuals who could not read or write, they could not vote. With all due respect, many Black individuals did not know how to read because they weren't getting the proper education and they just didn't have access to education. However, for those individuals that could understand what was going on and they could read when they would go to vote, unfortunately, white individuals would say they actually didn't understand. They didn't know how to read. Therefore, even though they did, they still couldn't vote. There was also the property tests, meaning if you didn't own property, you can vote. This is a restriction for many Black individuals because at the time, many of them couldn't own property because they weren't allowed to own property or they didn't have the financial ability to have property. There was also the grandfather clause, which was if you haven't voted, you could vote if your father or grandfather voted before 1867. This was extremely hard for some Black individuals because at that time, again, with all due respect, slavery was going on, and unfortunately, not many individuals had a father or grandfather who could vote. There was also poll taxes, meaning you had to pay to be able to vote. Obviously, this was very hard for many Black individuals because they were already facing a lot of discrimination. With this discrimination, they couldn't go get a proper education, meaning they couldn't land a good paying job. Unfortunately, if you're not earning a good, fair amount of money, you weren't able to pay these polls, meaning you couldn't vote. Now, there was violence and fear that was involved in this period. Um, Obviously, like as I just previously mentioned in the other slide, there was that fear of voting, and there was that fear that if they were going to vote or if they did vote, their families or them would have been hurt, they would have been assaulted, killed, things like that. Violence and fear was used as a way to enforce segregation, maintain white supremacy, and make Black Americans feel like the inferior race. Another violence that we have actually learned about in this class is lynching. Um, Individuals actually became very scared to ever speak up, go out of their houses, anything like that, because they were afraid that they or their families would suffer this tragedy. Now, there was some resistance against Jim Crow. Obviously, as we learned, there has been participation in boycotts, sit ins, protests. Those individuals who were lucky enough to get an education used that privilege to help individuals who could not get an education by being their voice or even teaching them how to read and write, like in secret. Um, Actually, even pastors and churches became a key support of this resistance against Jim Crow laws. Not only were they the voice in the home of God, but they actually became a place where activists would join and speak about future plans on these type of participations like protests and boycotts. And they actually became very well respected leaders within their community. They became someone that individuals could trust. Now, the civil rights movement, it involved key things that we learned about, such as Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. There was also the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. actually provided his famous I Had a Dream speech. The goal of the civil rights movement was to end legalized segregation and discrimination against black individuals. Some famous cases, I'm going to mention some more, but some that I wanted to include in this was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This actually banned the literacy test and other voter oppression tactics that I previously mentioned in the other slide. And there was also the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which actually prohibited discrimination on housing. This is one of those key cases I wanted to mention, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. This was a 1954 U.S. Supreme Court case that ruled that separate but equal educational facilities for racial minorities was actually unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This actually ended school segregation, and it is famous for saying the separate is not equal. Another one, which is the most extreme important one as well, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This actually dismantled the Jim Crow system. It outlawed segregation and banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It banned employment discrimination because of that other case that I previously mentioned. And also, most significant civil rights legislation. It was the most significant civil rights legislation, I do apologize, since the Reconstruction period. So these are some of the references that I used. I put the link on the slides that I used it. And obviously, one of the main sources that I did use was our textbook. Thank you, and I hope all of you guys have a great summer.